what you can do.
We're going live right now, so if I were you, I would watch your damn language. Hey, welcome to the Lovecraftian podcast.
What the fuck, Mike?
Huh?
What the fuck, Mike?
I'm your host, Gordon Ramsay. Mike Davis, Lovecraftian. And our guest today is Matt Ruff. Hey, Matt.
Hey.
How are you?
Good to see you guys again.
You
Doing
too.
very well, thank you.
Been like, what, a year and a half, 2 years, something like that?
Since the pandemic hit, it's like time has no meaning anymore. So
That's
yeah.
true.
It feels like Thursday was just 6 months ago.
And then since Lovecraft Country aired, I've been doing so many interviews that the time has even less meaning. So I'm just not even sure what time zone I'm in anymore. So
no, the next time we want to interview Matt, he's going to be so big that he's going to be like, look, don't contact me directly anymore. Talk to my people. They will get back to your people. And I will decide if I'm going to...
Which means they'll have to get back to Pete.
I hope it never comes to that. I just, I want to just make, I just want to be able to write the books I want to write and live quietly in peace and, maybe someday afford a house in Portland. And that's enough for me. I don't want to have people.
Yeah.
Not in that sense, no.
No, me either. All right, so we have a guest panelist also, Chesya Burke. Hey, Chesya.
Hi.
You don't have to mute, ma'am. You can stay unmuted.
I know, but you may hear noises. I'm in Florida, so a storm could happen at any moment.
Oh my
Wait,
God.
where in Florida are you?
Yes, I'm in Lake Mary.
Okay, I'm in Palm Beach.
Oh, okay. I'm not far from Orlando.
Right.
Close. Yeah.
My son goes to UCF.
Right. So we've been, it's been storming off and on all day. But hi, thank you. It was really nice to be here. Again.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. I'm really glad you could make it. Why don't we do introductions and boy, I'm looking at my notes. I'm thinking, what does that mean? Let's start with Matt. Matthew Carpenter. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Matt. I help run the Easing Movie Night now, and last night we watched episodes 1 and 2 of Lovecraft Country. I will spoil it by saying the musical score is incredible. Oh my God.
Yeah.
And our prize this week is a Lovecraft plushie. I got it from some Kickstarter. I have no idea. It's been sitting on my shelf for years. It's still in the shrink wrap.
What?
It could be yours. Send an email to easingprizes@gmail.com and you'll be entered.
What? A plushie?
A Lovecraft plushie. Before we can beat them up, there's racism.
That's true. Okay.
Since we can't hit the man, we can hit the plushie.
Yeah, he's dead, but you can go. I mean, kick his tombstone.
Well, if you want and you win the plushie, you can also have tea with him.
Are you sure that isn't just Frankenstein, though? Because it kind of looks more like Frankenstein. I'm just going to say that.
Well, it was
Absolutely,
in a box. Yep. It's been in a box for years, and I really don't know what it is. So
it can really be your Tim Burton character of choice, basically.
Yeah, where did you get it? Did it just show up in the mail?
No, I think it was part of a Kickstarter, because as a sub prize, I'm going to send in a fake straight jacket that came with it.
I'm sorry, but that could be anybody almost. That could be anybody.
Are you going to take that, Howard?
Rick, you want to introduce yourself?
Rick Lay, writer, and a man who may have paperbacks that even Pete doesn't know.
Really?
That's probably true.
Yeah. There's not a lot of people who can say that. Bridget?
Hello, I'm Bridget. I'm a composer, artist person, huge horror fan. Love being on here.
I'm glad you're here. Chesya Burke, would you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Chesya Burke. I do the writing thing. I'm also a scholar. I teach and I research generally Black horror, Afrofuturism, spec fic.
Okay. And then who we got left? Rich Bunting?
Hey, I'm Rich. No, I'm not part of the 1%. Somebody last week thought that I was. So when I said I'm rich, and no, I
You did?
Okay.
have a
I don't remember
library,
this.
and yeah, I don't do anything else except be a fanboy of the easing.
It's true. You've got the coolest background, I think, with the frame, that ornate photo.
You're
That's great.
not the first person to say that, Matt. Yeah. But let me see. If you look at his background carefully, do you see any books I've published? No. No, you don't.
I actually moved the horror to the other side, so all of the your published books are on the other side to the right here. Behind me is all Western civilization type books.
Oh, so you can look at them for inspiration during the podcast.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
exactly. Okay. Matt, before we get into Lovecraft Country, can you give us a little bit of your background for those who don't know you or know of you?
I am. I'm from New York City originally. My dad was a Lutheran minister from the Midwest, and my mother was a missionary's daughter who was born in southern Brazil, grew up in Argentina, and immigrated to the U.S. at 23. And our house in Queens was Ellis Island for all the other South American relatives coming up. And I basically came wired from the factory to want to tell stories. So I spent my childhood and adolescence teaching myself to write novels. And my parents were very supportive of this. My mother bought me my first typewriter and got one of my Argentine aunts to teach me how to touch type. And so I got all the bad writing and practice under my belt while other people were still paying for my food. And then by the time I got to Cornell University, I was ready to try and write something that I could publish. And I very impractically decided to study English with a concentration in creative writing, which if you don't want to teach, which I never wanted to do, is a completely useless degree unless you publish a novel right out of college. And so my senior thesis was my first published novel, Fool on the Hill. And one of my teachers was the novelist Alison Lurie, and she very kindly introduced me to her agent, Melanie Jackson, who sold Fool on the Hill about 6 months after I graduated. So I basically got very lucky. And the other thing was because I wasn't married and I never learned to drive, I didn't have a lot of expenses. So I was able to be comfortably poor during my 20s while I was waiting to build up enough of a backlist to be able to make a go of writing. And I also had this stroke of good luck that my first novel was purchased by Karl Hanser Verlag in Germany and translated in German. And for many years, I was actually more popular over there than I was in America. And so the foreign money helped me sort of keep myself from becoming homeless while I was working on my second novel. And over time, I built up enough of a backlist and got enough recognition for my other works that I was able to make a go of it. And so now it's like I've been a published author for, I guess, 32 years. So now it's like after 32 years, I'm suddenly an overnight success with the success of Lovecraft Country. So that's kind of how I got here. So basically what I warn people is, kids don't do what I did. Have a better plan for what you're going to do if you don't get your dream of being a published writer right away, because for most people there were other people I knew in college who were as talented as I was, or maybe more so, but the difference was they had other obligations and they couldn't keep at it long enough to break through, and so they had to get real jobs instead. So so that's my story basically.
It's a good lesson for writers, creative types of all stripes, that it's not just talent, it's luck too.
A lot of luck.
For example, you're wise enough to realize that, and you can make a go. It's not like you can never make a go of it if you don't get the right amount of luck. Yes, you can, but you have to stick with it maybe until the luck comes through, perhaps. And some people's luck comes as my friend Larry Barronlund has said several times, I'm paraphrasing, but there's far more talented people than him who are toiling in obscurity. Okay, so speaking of all the success, it's well deserved. And congratulations on Lovecraft Country and on the
Thank
series.
you. Yeah, I'm obviously over the moon about this, and I'm just so pleased with what Misha Green has done with the series. So it's just been a real pleasure to see. I mean, I knew it was going to be good, but it's one thing to know that and another to see it come to life. And I've just been so thrilled to death, particularly with these first 2 episodes. So yeah, and I can't wait to see. I haven't actually seen the whole season yet. I've gotten to see the same 5-episode preview that the critics got to see, but I don't know where it goes and how it's going to end. So I'm really curious about that. And I got to say that watching 1 episode a week is actually kind of good because there's so much going on in each episode, and then each one is going to be slightly different in tone too. So it's kind of nice to have that break to sort of think about what you saw and what the heck was that, and did I miss anything, and then see what's going to happen this week. So
well, it's been several years since I read the book, so I was actually kind of I've seen the first 2 episodes, so I was actually kind of surprised at the end of the 2nd episode. Here you got this first story arc, and then I remembered more or less the structure of the book, and I'm thinking, okay, there's season 1. What are they going to do in season 2? Then I don't say that in a derogatory way whatsoever. At the end, when I saw the first episode and it ended, I'm like, God damn it! I'm throwing stuff at the TV. Why can't you guys be like Amazon or Netflix and release them all at once? Because it's so good. So
yeah, that was a great opener, and it was that was the other thing. It's just a great translation. It captures the spirit of the book without being bound too closely to the actual events. And that was when Misha and I were talking about it early on. I basically said, here's my research. Here are my notes on what why I did the things that I did and the choices I made in the novel. And, you take what's useful and leave the rest. And, I've got my version of the story. You do what you have to do. And obviously part of the thing is I've not worked in a visual medium. So part of what's been fascinating for me is just seeing how they convey stuff that I would, be doing internal monologues or just description that you cannot do in a screenplay.
Right.
And convey that stuff. Often stuff that would take paragraphs in the novel is just like one image gets the point across. And so it's a real learning experience for me too, to watch that.
And it's always so important to remember in any book, Lord of the Rings, whatever, it's an adaptation,
Yeah, it's
not
a translation, really.
Yeah.
You're speaking a different dialect of storytelling in a way. So yeah.
You can't get too hung up on, oh my God, they didn't do this exactly like the book. No, that's okay. That's okay. Are they keeping to the spirit of it? Is it good?
Yeah.
Is it great storytelling? Which, from the 2 episodes I've seen, it sure as hell is. So, I'm glad to hear you're happy with it so far. You've seen the first 5.
I really am. And again, I can't wait to see where they go with it. So.
Yeah. What I do not want to do is monopolize all the questions. I'm seeing a couple of side notes on the live chat here. A couple of people asking where Mike Davis is. Yes, I did get a haircut. Matt, last week at this time, it was like down to here.
Okay.
Because I had COVID, shingles. I couldn't go get a haircut for several months. So finally, I was able to get a haircut the other day. So are you guys happy now? I'm watching.
I've discovered the power of the home buzz cut, and I don't think I'm ever going to go back to a barber now. So, because I'm sort of at that point in my life where any hair longer than a 1/4 inch makes me crazy anyway. So
yeah.
So,
These are important topics that we need to.
Speaking of monopolizing the time with stuff, yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry
exactly.
about that.
I'd like to start, if it's okay with you, Chesya. I'd like to start with you. Do you have any questions, comments, etc. for Matt Ruff or in general?
Don't put me on the spot or anything.
No, not at all. Not at all. Oh, I forgot to tell you when I invited you, you'd have to speak.
I I don't. Well, I do, and I will apologize just a little bit for not actually having any knowledge of any interviews or anything that you've done about the history of the book. One, I have been in school for the last 11 years, so that has monopolized. I got out like 2 weeks ago. So that has monopolized so much. But I do wonder where, again, you'll probably have to rehash a lot of stuff, but I do wonder where the background of the story came from for you. And the characters, which I understand are also Black in the book. So again,
sure. Oh yeah. Oh no, of course.
But yeah. So what led you to this? Because I know so much of the conversation around Lovecraft is about race, but it is also ignores race and pretends like he wasn't who he was in so many ways. So I'm wondering where you came from with that.
Can I just really briefly interrupt and comment on what you said, Chesya? I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all, because I think a lot of people watching and listening later too will not know the answer to those questions. Right. So asking these basic questions, I think, is a very good thing.
No, it's true. I mean, the same questions tend to come up in interviews, but what I've learned is like, I'm the only one who is present at all the interviews. And so, there are still plenty of people listening who probably are surprised to hear that this is based on a book at all. So, so as far as the actual history of this particular story, this started out as an unsuccessful TV series pitch back in 2007. There were some TV producers who were fans of my novel Bad Monkeys, who basically invited me to submit pitches for original TV series. And one of the things I was interested in doing was an X-Files type story where you'd have sort of a recurring cast of characters who would have, weekly paranormal adventures. And the twist that I came up with basically was that instead of making this about white FBI agents in the 1990s, it was going to be about a Black family who owned a travel agency in Chicago in the 1950s and published a fictional version of the Green Book called The Safe Negro Travel Guide. And, it was going to have the son of the family, Atticus Turner, as I called him, sort of driving around the country, doing research for the guide, looking for places that would take him in, and then getting drawn into these paranormal adventures. And eventually the whole family would come to be drawn into it. And so it would be, on the one hand, sort of traditional kind of horror, but it would also be exploring the sort of more mundane terrors of life for Black folks in a period when segregation was legal. And, this is something that many people watching the TV show still haven't quite got, that segregation was just as bad in the North and the West. It was just somewhat more insidious because the South embraced it openly, whereas the North, they didn't provide as extensive signage, but you ran into just as much trouble, which is why guidebooks like the Green Book were necessary. So I thought that would be an interesting thing to tell a story about. And Lovecraft came in kind of through the back door because I needed a thematic bridge between paranormal horror and racism, and Lovecraft is both. He's, he's this incredibly influential horror writer, but he's also an avid white supremacist. And the other thing I wanted to get at was this, Atticus in the book and in the series, he's a nerd. His Uncle George, who runs the travel agency, is also a nerd. They're fans of genre fiction, and it's this age-old dilemma of, fans of color, that the genre doesn't love you back. And Lovecraft is like, again, the ultimate example of that, of someone who, there's plenty of stuff in Lovecraft that is exciting and interesting to read, but if you're Black, he goes out of his way to let you know he not only doesn't consider you, worth writing about, but he doesn't see you as human. And so that just became a way of sort of getting at that as well. But although there were plenty of other examples I could have used and did use in the novel. So, but of course, so once I gave the story that title, and it became this sort of double entendre that Lovecraft Country, it's the paranormal landscape where monsters come from, but it's also white America where a different kind of monster comes from. Then I of course started bringing in some Lovecraftian tropes, like, there's a book called The Book of Names that is suspiciously like the Necronomicon, and there's a monster that Atticus sort of jokingly refers to as a Shoggoth. And of course, you've got this white cabal of sorcerers up in New England who have designs on Atticus and his family. But my goal always with the story was to sort of more broadly explore genre. So yes, it was going to be horror and Lovecraftian stuff, but also science fiction and fantasy and, whatever. And I had this idea of, like the X-Files, there would be this arc story involving, again, this cabal of sorcerers, but there would also be the Monster of the Week episodes where you had different members of the cast getting to star in their own reimagined weird tales, the kinds of things that Black readers might have dreamed about but would never have been included in. And, you know, how does it change things to have Jekyll and Hyde story where a Black woman gets to become white and experience life that way? And, you know, you have a haunted house story, but it's about a Black woman buying a house in a white neighborhood, and the house, the ghost is white too. So now she's got neighbors who want to burn her out and a ghost who doesn't want her there either. And she's got to figure out a way to play the dead off against the living to keep what's hers. Right. So I just thought there was a lot of interesting stuff you could do with this. And the problem was that the folks I was talking to was probably a little ahead of its time. I may not have been the best pitchman for it. And of course, it's expensive to do a period drama that is, you know, got special effects. And so anyway, they passed on that and my other ideas, but I fell in love with this idea. And I was like, okay.
This was 2007, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was like, okay, let me figure out if I can figure out a way to make this work as a novel. And the biggest difficulty was I really wanted to maintain this idea of the individual characters getting to each have their own adventure, which suggested a book of short stories, but I just didn't want to write a book of short stories. I wanted to write a novel. I had a feeling my publisher probably would be happier with a novel than a book of short stories too. And so that stymied me for quite a while, but eventually I realized what I could do is sort of a hybrid work that was like the literary version of a TV season, where it was like an episodic novel where each chapter was an episode of this fictional TV show. And that ended up figuring in even into the length of the chapters, where like the first chapter is somewhat longer than the others because that's the pilot episode. So that's the 2-hour pilot. And then most of them are about 10 or 15,000 words. And then there's one other chapter that's longer. And that's sort of like my sweeps week episode, the extra special revelations about what the bad guys are really up to. And it sounded weird, but it kind of worked. And my publisher liked it. And so I wrote it and published it. And, then I had a really lucky stroke of timing that the book came out in 2016, right around the time Jordan Peele was finishing up Get Out and was looking around for what he wanted to do next. And so I got this call from my agent in Hollywood who said, you know, this is kind of odd, but we got a call from Jordan Peele, and he's mostly known for comedy, but apparently he's looking to break into horror, and he really likes Lovecraft Country, and he wants to talk to you. And I said, fine, I'm happy to. And then I found out Misha Green was going to be on the call, and then I got really excited because she'd done Underground, which I'd loved. And so I thought, oh, sounds really interesting. And we got on the phone and had a really wonderful conversation where, for once, I mean, I talked with Hollywood people before where, you know, sometimes it seems like they've read a different book than the one you wrote. But in this case, we were all on exactly the same page. We were excited for the same reason. We saw the same potential. And I was like, this is great. And not long after that phone conversation, I saw the first trailer for Get Out, and I was like, oh, okay, now I understand why Jordan wants to do this. So, and the success of Get Out is basically what paved the way for, HBO to pick up Lovecraft Country. So it was just a real stroke of luck and timing for me. So that's basically the history of it. And, and more generally about my fiction, my novels are all very different, but I generally really like writing stories about people who come from different backgrounds than I do, who have different challenges than I do. So, strikes some people as rather odd that a white guy would write a book like this, but to me, it's just sort of a general extension of what I've always done with fiction. And some of the roots of the story go back as far as my time at Cornell, where one of my friends at Cornell was a guy named Joe Scandalbury, who was the residence hall director at a place called Ujma, which is the program house associated with the Africana Studies Center at Cornell. And I used to hang around with Joe, and one of Joe's jobs was to be sort of an ambassador and sort of try and explain to well-intended, naive white people like what his experience in life was like. And so a lot of, Lovecraft Country grew out of my interest in the themes that eventually became Lovecraft Country, grew out of that conversations I had with Joe and conversations I had with Professor James Turner at the Africana Studies Center. So that sort of fed into this. And, I thought about the stuff they told me back in the 1980s for a very long time. And then finally I came up with a novel idea where that kind of all fit. So okay. That in a very rambly way is how this happened.
Thanks.
I'll tell you where episode 1 really got me while I'm thinking about it is when they're sitting, when they're visiting, I think it's her brother. Is that right? Her brother's house. They
Brother
stop
Marvin,
there. Yeah, and they're sitting around after dinner, and they're talking about, you know, these weird things that happen in the woods around Artem, and you know, my heart just sort of skipped a beat there. I'm like, okay, I'm really loving this build up here, and you know, and the other thing is I thought was so great was when they stop by the woods, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on Atticus's female friend's name.
Letitia.
Letitia?
Yeah.
Yes,
Letitia.
that's right. Letitia, thank you. She goes, what are those? I wonder what those sounds in the woods are. Wolves, you know, what says something like that. And he jokes and he says, they're probably shoggoths. And she's like, well, what are shoggoths? And he explains. And, you know, I hope no one watching or listening to this has not seen the first episode because I'm about to spoil something. It's shoggoths, pretty much, which I thought was so funny.
Yeah. I mean, not obviously not exactly, but
right.
I mean, for one thing, they're cuter in a weird way. I mean, they're scary, but they're also
they're so cute when they're killing people.
Yes, and they're talking about that, and then in the background you see the sheriff's car pulling up, and you're like, that's where the real problem is going to be. And
right.
So yeah, that's just a great scene in the series for sure. And it's what's interesting in the novel. It's like that incident, that particular encounter actually happens to somebody else earlier when George is telling Atticus what Devon County is like. He's like, yeah, I had another researcher, another guy go out there and encounter this weird sheriff out there. So Misha took that incident and sort of combined it with a different encounter that actually happens to George and Atticus and Letitia in the novel. And it's a great juxtaposition, a great example of taking the different elements of the novel and reconfiguring them in a way that works much more dramatically in that 1 hour time frame that you've got for that first episode. So yeah, it's a really effective scene.
Yeah, it is. Chesya, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to butt in. What else would you like to? Do you have anything else right now? Nothing?
Not right now.
Not right now. Chesya's like, my God, would he stop putting me on the spot? You know, I've seen. I've got a forum, Lovecraft Easing Facebook page. It has like 220,000 people, and it's amazing because over the years I've maintained it so that the comments are usually very polite. And even when I would bring up Lovecraft Country the last couple of weeks, 95% of the comments were polite. Of course, then you have those 5% of, you know, assholes who think that, you know, Matt Ruff is stealing Lovecraft or variations on this, you know, this sort of thing. And, you know, Lovecraft really wasn't that racist and blah, 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 blah. You know, instead of, look, this is about empathy. This is about, you know, when I'm watching the show and the sheriff's car pulls up, I feel like I'm in the position of those characters, even though I never will, let's not kid ourselves, I will never know what it's like to be black. But as I've said several times, I can listen and I can do my best to empathize. And when they pull up, you know, I just feel this sense of dread, like, oh my God, whatever's in the woods, these guys are worse right here that are pulling up. You know, these white police officers. So,
if I can,
please.
I agree. I think it does a really great job of looking at horror in the way that often, you know, historically Black people have done, right? In that it's, while there's these, you know, great forces, as Lovecraft talks about, right, that we don't understand and we don't know and we should fear. But there are also those forces for Black people that is right here, right? And they are all around them and there's no getting away from it. And we can see that when we see, you know, the sundown towns and we see, you know, what just going to sit in a restaurant, for instance, you know, what it can do. And so I think that it captures in a lot of ways, you know, that dreaded fear that is, I would really rather meet a vengeful, evil spirit. I would rather meet the devil than I would meet go into a sundown town or meet a sheriff with a shotgun, right? Those things are less scary for me.
Well,
Yeah. Victor
it really
said,
presents a sort of dichotomy between this sort of existential threat that you know is out there, and yes, it could be damaging to you, but not immediately.
mhm,
So you can put that on the back burner
mhm.
Right.
versus what's happening right here, right now, that could hurt you, your family, or your friends. And that's a hard balance for people to try and deal with. You know,
And in 2020, so many people still don't get it. It's fucking 2020, man. You know?
I was shocked to see how many people literally had no idea that sundown towns existed and still, to this day, exist, right?
Well-
and they just have no idea that this is a thing, and they do not know that Black people and other people live their lives in a way that they have to fear where they are at all times.
I knew that
And-
they did, but I'll tell you what I did learn from Matt's book that I did not know was about the Green Book. Chesya or Matt, who wants to explain what the Green Book was?
Well, I mean,
Um,
go ahead.
No,
Okay,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. You go ahead.
So green books were basically books written by and for Black people that let them know where are safe places for them to travel if they decide to get on the road, right? So it would list a lot of things like, where could you stop for gas? Where could you eat? Where can you sleep? What are going to be the safe places? But more importantly, it would also list the places for you to definitely avoid,
Yeah.
so that you could be safer when you're on the road. Anything you want to add, Matt?
Well, yeah, and
That's so
I
fascinating.
first learned about this from a book by Professor James Lowen called Sundown Towns, which is a sort of a history of whites-only communities in the U.S.
That's an actual book, by the way.
He mentioned that in his book, Lies My Teacher Told Me.
Yeah.
So that's where I heard about it.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, that I have not read it, but there is a book titled Sundown Towns, which
that's the book,
Yeah.
and it is. I mean, it was very inspirational for me writing Lovecraft. I mean, the Green Book fascinated me because it hints at this much larger, largely forgotten infrastructure that Black folks created during the Jim Crow era. Basically, like the long-term goal was always equality, but people had to live their lives in the meantime. And so you needed to come up with all these mechanisms to sort of negotiate and figure out where you could safely go. And same thing with professional organizations. If you were Black, you could not become a realtor because the realtors organization wouldn't accept Black real estate agents. So they created the Realtists, who were a more open professional organization. And you couldn't be a regular Freemason, but you could be a Prince Hall Freemason, and so on. So it was like cracking this code. And once I learned about this, it was just fascinating to me. And it struck me as a really interesting subject to build a story around, because again, it's about, yes, we are in this country that doesn't really have a place for us. How are we going to find our way? And that was just a really interesting thing to learn about and to write about. And Lowen talks about a couple of other things. Like that's also where I first heard about the Tulsa massacre, which is an incident where the white community in Tulsa, they were frustrated at their attempts to lynch a single Black man who'd been arrested and was being held in the city jail. So they instead basically invaded and burned down this prosperous Black neighborhood called Greenwood. So killed like 300 people, burned 35 city blocks to the ground. And there too, that's kind of just the tip of the iceberg. Like the larger thing that Lowen is talking about in Sundown Towns is that, we kind of know the story about what went on in the South, but what we've largely forgotten is that, starting around the 1890s and continuing through the 20th century, there was this sort of wave of ethnic cleansing where white citizens in the West and North basically tried to drive out non-white people from their communities. And starting with Chinese on the West Coast, but African Americans became a principal target not long afterwards. And we remember certain incidents like Tulsa because they were so big that they couldn't be covered up completely afterwards. But there were probably hundreds of smaller incidents where towns drove out, they'd maybe 10 Black families and they were all driven out. And then afterwards, this cultural amnesia set in and kids grew up in an all-white town and it just seemed natural. And so
there were no camera phones. You know?
Right. So it just, and this is even today, it just like, there are big parts of the country where you don't expect to see anybody who isn't white. And if you don't know the history, it's just like, well, you know, maybe they just didn't like the weather in Montana, you know, and it's not true. There's actually there's a horror story there that people have forgotten about. And Lowen does it the best job he can at sort of adducing evidence for this and documenting it. But the problem is that in a lot of cases, there just aren't records left because the people who could tell the tale didn't, and now they died. You know, that a lot of that knowledge is just lost. But you can see it in the census records where, again, he does this thing where he looks at census records for, you know, say Illinois, and like right after the Civil War, there are black folks in pretty much every county in the state, and that number starts to drop. And that's not just, again, it's not like, oh, we don't like the weather down here in southern Illinois. It's like, no, they're getting attacked, they're getting driven out, and Chicago is, in certain parts of Chicago, are really the only place to go if you're going to stay in the state. So yeah, that was stuff I thought would be interesting to tell the story about.
There's a scene in American Gods in one of the first couple of episodes where, and I'm not an expert on American Gods, so you guys might have to correct me a bit, but the gentleman who plays, what was he, a trickster god?
Orlando Jones? Yeah, I don't know the name of the god, but it's the actor's Orlando Jones.
So he you know, they're bringing over...
I'm sorry, Mike, it's Anansi, the spider.
Ah, yeah, that's right.
Yes, thank you so much. Correct me if I'm wrong again, but the scene is that the white slave traders they've got black slaves down in the hold, and they're bringing them from Africa to America to be slaves. It's been several years since I've seen this. So Orlando Jones' character shows up and he says, not only is it horrible now, it's going to be horrible for the next 400 or 500 years. And, you know, to these guys, he's talking about driving while black, you know, things they don't understand because, you know, he moves back and forth through time apparently. But it just hit me, these guys, they're coming over to America. The next generation is not going to be better. The next generation is not going to be better. The next generation is not going to be better. It really hit me hard in the gut. And that was a really, really powerful scene. I mean, I don't know if it struck any of you guys that way, but it certainly did.
Oh yeah,
me,
sure.
the hopelessness of those poor people's situation. All because, you know what? Their skin color was darker than theirs. That's why. You know, the human race is just terribly astounding in its evil sometimes, I think, you know. The other thing I wanted to briefly mention was, and I don't remember if you do this in the book or not, Matt, but was the son replaced by a daughter?
Yeah, they switched two characters.
Yeah.
In the book, Hippolyta and George have a son, Horace, and Misha changed it to Diana because I think her explanation, she said to me in the interviews, basically she felt like the difficulties, particularly that young black girls have growing up, had not been explored quite so much in fiction as the difficulties young black men had growing up. And I'm fine with that. And
yeah.
The other thing too is that in writing the book, Horace is probably the character I most closely identified with, just because he's this young budding artist who, he's still at that age where you don't quite realize what you're going to be up against as you get older. And so, but with Misha in the central creative role for the series, it just kind of there's a perfect symmetry in having Horace become Diana. And the other change was, the big bad in the novel is Caleb Braithwaite, the son of the Braithwaite family. And in the series, he's become Christina. And again, that seems like a perfectly reasonable change. And I think Misha wanted to explore there too, the differences of the particular challenges that white women face, where they're not, they're oppressed, but in a different way. And
right. It touches on the sexism of it because she's talking to Atticus.
Right.
And she's like, no matter how hard I try, my father would never give me, one of these rings.
Right.
And he's like, because you're a woman and I'm a man and a black man at that, and I get this, So
I mean,
I think it's a great.
It's a
great
valid
change.
choice. I
Yes.
mean, the thing is in the novel, right? I made this command decision early on that all of the viewpoint characters would be black because it just seemed intuitively obvious to me that in a story about the horrors of racism, I wanted to keep the focus on the people for whom it was a horror. I did not want to go off and spend time in Caleb Braithwaite's head. And that kind of, to my way of thinking, that kind of dictated that he had to be a guy, because a woman in that position, it would have been just too interesting not to want to see what she was thinking. What makes Caleb interesting to me, though, in the novel is it's more about how people react to him. He's not that, it's not, you don't have to get inside his head to kind of get where he's coming from. He's one of these guys who cannot conceive of himself as a bad guy and is just utterly relentless in going after what he wants. But he's nice about it. It's like you can call him an evil guy to his face, and he'll just kind of nod, and he'll be like, look, I understand you're upset, but here's what I'm going to give you if you help me out. And he's like the really annoying relative who comes to your house and won't go home. That's basically how I thought of him. So
I'm getting a visit next Friday.
I didn't need to get in his head to sort of do that. But with the TV show, obviously that sort of perspective thing isn't as big of a deal. So you're not really in anyone's head. You're just following different people at different times. So it becomes less of an issue. So again, I think that's a perfectly interesting and valid change.
There's no doubt Misha Green really knows what she's doing.
Oh yeah. So.
Speaking of annoying visitors, Matt, are you still coming to Corsicana on Friday? Matt Carpenter?
Yeah, I'm coming on Friday.
Okay, I just had to
got a wedding to go to.
I just had to.
I'm getting a no expenses paid trip.
No, oh wow, you are so lucky. Anyway,
Chesya, you were saying something?
Oh, I was just going to point out that I find it, really interesting, because if I'm following this correctly, you're saying that the bad guy that you had in your book was a white guy.
Yeah.
The big bad, right? But it's changed to a white woman. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I find it interesting that you would need to get into the head of her for that to happen. But I think that coming from a perspective as a Black woman, to me, it looks very, like, I understand it as clearly as I would a white man, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the way that, historically white women have had power, especially over darker bodies, right? And we have
Sure.
and it has not been explored. We have not talked about that. We don't tend to talk about those things. So I find that really interesting. And now I do want to juxtapose and read both the books. Not that I didn't before, right? But I have more time now.
No, but I mean, for me, no, I understand. But it's just like, it's like, that's the thing, though. For me, I really would have wanted to know more about how she related to her family and stuff. And with Caleb Braithwaite, it was just like, I don't really need to know that, because I can, he's fairly transparent. And what's funny, though, is that there are readers who just don't quite, because he's polite. Like, there are other Black villains like the sheriff who are much more violent and cruel, and where Caleb is unfailingly polite. He's really nice. Like, he uses the characters, but he tries to make up for it afterwards. And it's sort of like, you don't really have a choice about being exploited by him, but he at least tries to be as nice about it as possible. And for some reason, some readers don't, because he doesn't swear, he doesn't use racial epithets. Somehow that makes him okay. And they wonder, well, is he really that bad?
Right.
And I'm
right.
Are you kidding me? Are you not paying attention? But
actions.
I love the nuances. I do. I love it because it really is capturing all the ways in which Black people exist, right? Like the way that we have to prove that racism isn't just about someone calling you the N-word or someone being, keep trying to keep you out of their town. It's these little things, like, right? It's all of that stuff. It's the systemic stuff that you have to deal with. And so I do think that it's doing a really great job of picking up on those things. And so, that's really interesting. Thanks.
Go
I
ahead.
wanted to say a little more about the title. I mean, I of course, because it is a somewhat metaphorical title, I understand that, to people coming to the show and to the book who, didn't know anything about it, if you have assumptions that a book called Lovecraft Country is going to be a Lovecraftian story exclusively, obviously you're going to be a little disappointed. And there's this other issue where I know that, some folks really, really love the idea of Lovecraft rolling over in his grave at the thought of this. And I appreciate why people feel that way. But for me, it was never about settling a score. I mean, for one thing, I just, to get a little Neil deGrasse Tyson about it, dead people don't roll over in their graves. They just lie there. It's like Lovecraft is beyond the reach of insult, and you can't save him either, which I would hope would be my first impulse if I actually could meet him. But for me, it was never about attacking Lovecraft, or even really like the point of having, to the extent that his fiction is in the story, it's more about the dilemma of the Black reader than it is about saying anything specific about Lovecraft himself. Because yes, Lovecraft is racist and that's bad is an obviously true statement, but dramatically it's not particularly interesting. So I wouldn't write a novel just to say that. If I wanted to engage more specifically with Lovecraft's legacy, I probably would have written a story and tried to figure out a way to bring Lovecraft himself into the story and try to understand what made him embrace that white supremacist attitude, which is something I'm still not entirely clear on. I've got some ideas about it, but that to me is the interesting question, because if you look at his life, it didn't make him happy. He didn't really benefit from it in any, like he came from a family that had been wealthy at one time, but by the time he was born, the family was in decline, and his life is this arc of more and more dire circumstances, and he ends up living alone in this one-bedroom apartment and dying at a fairly young age. And racism, for the most part, poisoned his life. It made it harder. I mean, it ruined his marriage. It made it impossible for him to enjoy living in New York, which I cannot help but feel pity for someone who can't enjoy living in New York. Right. And, his wife would describe how, when he was in Manhattan and he would see the Eastern immigrants, the Eastern European immigrants coming up out of the subway, he would shake with rage at the sight of them. And, that kind of rage can be energizing, but it's also must be just exhausting. And this guy must have just been so tired by the end, and he died alone. And I want to understand what was the appeal? Why, because it's not like he didn't have people in his life who didn't try to talk him out of it. His wife said, look, you don't have to like these people, but can you just don't hate them? Can't you let go of your anger? And, one of his friends, John Ferdinand Morton, was an activist who was very, he met Lovecraft basically because he disagreed with him about civil rights, and they became friends. And I have to imagine Morton spent a lot of their time together trying to get Lovecraft to let go of this, racist outlook. And I would love to have been a fly on the wall for some of the conversations, but obviously it didn't work. So I kind of want to figure him out.
There's this,
but this is not that novel. So
no, there's this, I'm sorry, Chesya, you were going to say something else.
No. I don't want to dominate the conversation. Because
dominate.
I can't do that. No, I guess I would say that it is not all that fascinating to me that a racist is a racist, I guess I would say, right? Mm-hmm. Trying to figure them out is like, why they do or say or think that what they do is, it's beyond reason in so many ways, yes. Right? And there's this book, and I hate to get too academic on, but there's this book called Dying of Whiteness, and it talks about the way that, people whose ideologies, are, they have racist ideologies, they will hold on to those ideologies even in the midst of killing themselves. So this book looks a lot at like the way racists were against Obama, even though Obama's healthcare system would have helped them. Right. And so it goes in and it looks at, one guy and asked him, when he was dying, I think he had some kind of terminal disease, whereas he could have, used Obamacare to help him, and he chose not to. And he literally says that he would rather die than have other people have access to what he could also have access to, which was healthcare at this time, right? So racism, I guess I say that to say racism is not all that fascinating. It's really just like, people get to hold on to like the superiority complex. I guess it would make a lot of sense for Lovecraft, whose family would have lost money and he has someone to blame.
Oh, I'm sure that, I'm sure that played a part in it, obviously. And I mean, in general, I know what you're saying, and the truth is a lot of these guys are just not that interesting. I think
Right.
in Lovecraft's case, I'm curious because I there's a lot in his fiction that I find really fascinating, and that's what this is a specific instance where I kind of want to know what the hell is making him tick. But yeah, I've had this conversation with there's another writer I'm friends with, Paul Lafarge, who wrote a book called The Night Ocean, and I was asking at one point, is there any character who you would not try to, you would just consider beyond the pale to try to make sense of? And he said, no, not really, but there are people who are just not particularly interesting. And one example he gave was I think it was a concentration camp commandant. And he's like, the problem with trying to write from this guy's point of view is that he had no self-awareness. He was just, there was nothing really interesting. He didn't have the self-awareness that an interesting character has to have. He just did what he did because that was what he was like. And there wasn't, there wasn't enough going on inside to make him worth thinking about. And, it would just be boring drama. And I can get that. There are characters who, even if you could understand them, there's just not a lot there that makes for good storytelling. But in Lovecraft's case, I kind of feel like there might be. So,
I was about to say a variation of what Chesya said, that respectfully, I don't care, about that. And it's fine that you do. I'm speaking personally. I run a site, podcast, small publishing, whatever it is I do. I'm still not sure what it is, called the Lovecraft Easy. But I've never, you give it up. I've never been interested in Lovecraft as a person. And it's always amazing to me the number of people who are interested in Lovecraft as a person, who almost worship the guy. I'm interested in Lovecraftian horror. I'm interested in cosmic horror. I'm interested in weird fiction. And the words Lovecraft and Lovecraftian, to me, are just a shortcut to all of that. Lovecraftian horror means this, and so, I just don't. A lot of people seem to focus on the man instead of on the themes. I'm far, far more interested in the themes of Lovecraft. Yeah, Pete.
All right, so I want to take us in a slightly different direction, but I want to build on that. Mike brought up American Gods earlier.
Yeah.
American Gods is, oddly enough, written by a Brit, but a very American fantasy novel. I'm kind of feeling like Lovecraft Country is a comparable American fantasy epic. Now, bear with me, because you've written it as a horror novel. But the Green Book is a map.
Mm-hmm.
It is the map of the safe way through the forest.
Yeah.
Atticus is a soldier.
Right.
His uncle is a ranger, whose job it is to go out and extend the length of the map to see what's out there, and how does his civilization make its way through this jungle. Jungle's a bad word, but forest to save places. How does it function in this world that is surrounded by things that are dangerous? Yeah. And it functions in many ways as a quest novel for America in the 21st century, in the 1950s. And maybe I've read too much into it, but maybe I'm thinking that it's a way of looking at this novel that hasn't been considered.
Well, I think being compared to Gaiman's probably a good thing.
I'll take that. Yeah, I mean, the thing you're having trouble with is that the actual genre is it's a Matt Ruff novel, and one of the side effects of having been self-taught is that I never got too hung up on genre classifications. Like they're useful to talk about stuff, and I'm obviously familiar with all the tropes and things like that, but each of my novels is very different from the other. And while there's usually one or two dominant genres, if you get in there, I'm grabbing from whatever is useful. And I'm not, so yeah, you can argue a dozen different ways. And I'm totally fine to nerd out on that. But yeah, I didn't have a plan. And like I would never say, well, because this is such and such genre novel, I can't do that. I might say, well, when I try that, it doesn't really work because there's this weird disconnect in mood or style. But if it does work, I don't care if these two things don't normally go together. It's like, sure. So, yeah. But that's the confusion, I think. If people try to pigeonhole me or classify me in a particular way, it's just my publicist. This is my way. Publicists kind of pull their hair out because how do we sell this? So yeah,
yeah. Your work is very meta genre. You build on. Philip K. Dick, H.P. Lovecraft, obviously a whole slew of understanding about what works in the fantasy, science fiction, horror genre.
Mm-hmm.
And you've done that in Mirage, flipping the history, and in Electric, Sewer, and Gas.
Sewer, Gas, and Electric, which is it's a science fiction satire of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, but it's a bunch of other things too. I mean, exactly. I've got a shark loose in the sewers, so it's like Jaws, but not Jaws. So yeah, and then I managed to have my Tom Clancy submarine battle in the second part of the book. So I mean, this has always been the case with my fiction, where I've my very first novel, Fool on the Hill, was really 4 different stories all thrown together into one novel. And it's like, let me see if I can make this work. And weirdly enough, I was able to make this work. And that, and thank goodness my publisher let me run with this stuff. So yeah, it's just, I don't want to limit the tools I can use if I'm writing. And I appreciate that. One of the useful things that these genre categories do is they do make it easier to sell books and to tell people, well, if you like this, then this is kind of like it. And you can, but one of the things is, like, the most interesting fiction is often the stuff that's hardest to classify. And I tend to drift towards that, both in what I read and what I write. So
couple things. First of all, and maybe the most important thing I'll say all day, is that Linda Addison is watching live and commenting. So hey, Linda, I make no secret of the fact, since I met Linda face-to-face via Zoom, you were there too, Chesya, and so was Craig, a couple months ago. She is just so great. She says, Dr. Burke, breaking it down from Black point of view. So let you know that, Chesya. You have a question from Mark Metz, Matt, on the live show here. I'm really amazed at how well you presented the struggles your characters face in comparison with what life was actually like in the 50s. Can you discuss how you were able to do that so well? Your friend Joe helped, I think, maybe get you started a little bit. I read that story.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I mean, a lot of it is just all of again, part of this is just a side effect of having grown up in this sort of multicultural theological hothouse in New York, where I had, the South American relatives, the North American relatives, and then there's this religious divide in the family where most of the family's Lutheran, but my grandmother, who also lived with us, had converted to Mormonism. So first thing, the relatives come in the door, they put their suitcases down, grab a Bible, go downstairs, try and save grandma and bring her back to the true faith. And basically, I learned very early on I was going to be spending much of my time on this planet surrounded by people who did not see things the way I did. And I, no matter how angry we might get at each other, I still had to find a way to get on with them and understand them and make peace with them. So, and this just sort of got into my fiction, where the 2 most consistent themes in my fiction are, one, culture clashes, bringing together people from different points of view and not giving them easy outs, where, they they magically come to agree about the same thing. But how do you get on with people who you're never going to agree with about a lot of stuff?
Yeah.
And the other thing is using fiction to get inside the heads of folks who aren't like me, or who may be like me in some ways, but have very different constraints and limitations that they have to face in their lives. And I love the challenge of creating psychologically realistic portraits. And so I've just got a lot of practice doing that. And Lovecraft Country is not a novel I could have written when I was younger, but at this point I've been doing it long enough that I feel pretty confident. It's basically, I start with a general sense of who each of my characters is as an individual, what I need them to do in the story, how they relate to each other, what their personal history is. And then, and in the case of Lovecraft Country, the biggest part of the research was just learning what the rules really were like if you were Black in that time. Like the if you wanted to buy a house in a white neighborhood, what would that entail? If you wanted to go for a drive in the countryside, what would you be looking out for? And just lots of things like that. It was sort of almost a science fictional approach of, understanding the country, that this alien country that my characters lived in and had to deal with and were reacting to. And then how are, rational, resourceful people going to deal with that? How are they going to react to that? And the trick was just never assuming that they were that different from me. It was more their circumstances and the necessary adaptations they had to have in order to survive and thrive and keep themselves sane were going to be different. So
that last sentence, that's such a great point.
Well, because this is a reaction I've seen to the TV series where people are just like, oh, wow, this is so wild. We're having Black characters who enjoy reading books and doing this and that. And I'm like, of course, why wouldn't they? It's, that's not the part that's different. The part is, the part that's different is where you go into the wrong neighborhood or pull into the wrong town after dark and there's going to be trouble. And that, and you've constantly got to think about that. And little things like that. But yeah, so that was basically just doing a lot of research about the conditions on the ground and the history, and then approaching it the way I would any other characters I was writing about, and using the tools I've learned writing about characters generally. And you start writing, you basically want to get to a point where I have a general grasp of how each of my characters would react in a given situation, how they talk, and then from there, you start telling the story, and inevitably I reach a point where I know why I need somebody to do something, but I haven't quite figured out why they would do it. So, for example, in the novel, one of the things was like Letitia, comes along on this trip with Atticus and George. And initially the idea is she's going to stay at her brother Marvin's. But of course, I knew all along, having put her in the car, that I needed her to continue on to Artem. And I knew why I wanted to do that, but I spent a really long time figuring out, well, why would she want to do that? It's like, even if she wants to help Atticus find his dad, it's like, he's an ex-soldier, the uncle's got a gun. If they can't deal with whatever's waiting for them there, what is she going to contribute? And basically, I spent a long time coming up with an explanation that made sense for why she would want to come along. And you can read the novel. It's a long thing to go into here, but obviously, in that you see the same sort of thing in the TV show, where that argument she gets into with her brother Marvin, partly that is to provide a pretext for why she gets back in the car with him the next morning and keeps going with him, because the plan was always she was going to stop there. And so,
I thought that
it tells you something. Yeah.
When I watched the show, I was like, oh, that's such a valid reason, not, I want to hang out with you guys.
Right, exactly. And that was the problem I had when I was initially considering the novel. Is like, okay, yeah, it's why would she want to go along? Because it's dangerous, and it's not like you can come up with a lazy reason like, well, she's the love interest or whatever, and it's like, yeah, that's not why she's going to do it.
Yeah.
So I had to come up with my reason, and then again, the TV show, they had to come up with a reason. And the thing is, in explaining why, you learn something about her, because it's not just she had a fight with her brother. It's like she had a fight with her brother about money. She thinks that it's more important to, spend money to get her friends out of jail who are protesting, for civil rights. And he's like, well, you're supposed to come home and be at mom's funeral. So you're learning about who she is in the process. And that's sort of the driving way that you develop characters the way that I develop characters as I go along. And as you get further and further into the story, there comes a point where I just know who they are as people.
And Matt, I have to tell you, it's brilliantly done, because it's not this.
Thank you.
It's not this info dump. You know, it's you're teaching the reader / audience about the character through the actions that they take, like what you just said about how she spends her money and why she gets in an argument with her brother,
right?
You know, and that sort of thing. Victor Lavelle, as you know, wrote the Ballad of Black Tom, which I think next year is going to be on AMC, if I remember correctly.
Oh, that's great. So yeah, I knew he was developing it. I didn't know they had an air date yet.
I don't know. I just know that it's coming. I thought I read 2021, but I could be wrong. He was interviewed in Glamodity last week, or something like that. And one of his quotes in that article inspired me to write an article on the Lovecraftian website, which, if anyone is interested, and you certainly don't have to be, just go to lovecraftian.com, and it's the first link up there on the splash page. But Victor says, and I quote this right away in my article, that horrific realization that all Lovecraft's characters undergo, that the universe does not revolve around them, that's not a problem that any black character would ever have. If you're black, you don't think the universe as a whole thinks you're wonderful, because all you have to do, if you're a black American, all you have to do is walk through America, and this country teaches you. The idea that you would be driven mad because you found out that the universe doesn't think you're special is a joke to a black American. You know, so it's just, it's all about, I think it boils down to empathy. All the things that you've been talking about, Matt, you're able to have this empathy to get into these characters' heads, you know, and that's part of what makes a good novelist, I think, a good creator.
Right. And I mean, again, the trick is, the biggest trick, right, is just having the desire. I mean, because I think this is a fallacy that, I mean, the reason that, you know, there is this track record of white authors not doing a terribly good job about this. And I think a lot of folks, out of just, you know, sort of fatalism, were just like, well, maybe they just can't understand that. I never believed that. I just always assumed that a lot of people just don't care. They just don't want to write about people who are not like themselves. They're just not interested in exploring different points of view. And I did. So I just never assumed I couldn't do it. I just figured I've just got to put in the work to get it done. And I never doubted that I could sort of get the story told. It was just a question of how much work I was willing to put into it. But it's, you know, it's very rewarding when it works. So
there's a really, really bad movie called Soul Man. And Chesya, I think you had something else to say. Do you want to go
There
first?
is a really bad movie called Soul Man.
Yes, there is a really bad movie called Soul Man. I'll quote it, and then I want to move to Chesya. At the end, I mean, there is one thing good about it. At the end, James Earl Jones, of all people, I love that guy, plays a guy called Professor Banks. He's the professor of this guy named Mark Watson, I think it was. I haven't seen this in 30 years. And the ridiculous idea behind this movie, for those who don't know, is he takes a lot of suntan pills or whatever and becomes black. It's pretty ridiculous. But anyway, people think he's black in the movie. So after he, quote, turns back white, he's talking to his professor, hanging his head, and the professor says, you've learned something, and this I quoted in my article too, you've learned something that I can't teach them. You've learned what it feels like to be black. And Mark, who seems to have finally learned his lesson, says, no, sir. And Professor Banks, if you can imagine James Earl Jones, you know, beg your pardon. And Mark says, I don't really know what it feels like, sir. If I didn't like it, I could always get out. It's not the same, sir. And Professor Banks says, you've learned a great more than I thought. So, which is really, don't go see that movie. That's the only good thing
So
about that
can
movie.
Mike, can I just interject?
No.
Back when I was in high school, we were all encouraged to read a book called Black Like Me.
Yeah.
And you may have, this was like written in the very early 60s, I think. This guy essentially did the same thing in real life. He dyed his skin and he went to the Deep South and he went around some places.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe at the time it seemed very daring, but when I read it, it was close to 20 years later. And it was like, even then, even as a naive high schooler, I could say, he didn't really do anything. He didn't go anywhere dangerous. He didn't make any protests. He didn't try and sit at the lunch counter. He kind of hung around like some bus stations or something. He didn't do much of anything. And it's like, this is nothing really, this is not a real experience that we should be devoting our reading to. Why don't you read the memorial of someone who actually lived it, their life?
Yeah.
Very similar thought. It's just, but at the time it was quite daring.
Black Like Me was even made into a movie with James Whitmore, which isn't that good, in the 50s.
Carpenter, they had books when you were in high school? You didn't read this on a stone tablet or
No, it was on papyrus.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry, Chesya. I think you had some more to say.
I was just going to point out what Matt was talking about, about writing, and what, that some authors don't tend to want to write about different things. And something that I've talked about, I'm also in horror. I write a lot of horror. I've also railed against horror for quite some time. So I'm that person. But I think one of the things that we don't talk about a lot in horror is that a lot of horror writing seems to be very much about fantasy. And not fantasy in the way that we look at, fantasy and high fantasy and things like that. But it's very often about like the idea of that middle-class white person, the self, writing themselves as a hero and, needing to save the day, save the girl from that bad thing, do those things that very often, it's mundane to like an outside reader such as myself, that it's like, well, that's an everyday for you, right? It isn't a real horrific, right? Even when we get to the bad monster, it isn't like something that, again, for me, and many people like me, horror isn't scary because it isn't set enough in the real experiences, if you will. It's more fantasy, and it doesn't apply when you're looking at, let's say, real trauma and real horror. So that's kind of just what I was going to mention when you talked about people, writers tending not to want to write outside that, that character. Or that, ideology, rather.
Another live chat comment from Linda Addison says, Dr. Burke, excellent horror writer, by the way. So.
Thank you.
Did I say I was a fan of Linda Addison? God, I'm not sure if I've mentioned it more than yeah, I am. And Linda, I know since you're watching, you have an extended invitation to come on the show anytime you feel like it. No pressure, but I just love having you on. So, in your points of view. I'm sorry, Matt Ruff, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I'm good.
No? Anyone else? Gonna say something?
Yeah. Matt, is Letitia your favorite character?
No, I think it would probably be a toss-up between Hippolyta and Ruby. Letitia was a close third. The women in general were just really interesting to write, but I think Ruby's situation has just so many interesting moral dilemmas attached to it. I loved getting into that, and again, Hippolyta was just an amazingly fun character to write. And partly the challenge with her is that this is different than in the series. In the book, the first time you actually meet her, she's the first character who has basically a chapter devoted to her who you only meet when you start her chapter. So I had to introduce her, give her backstory, and tell the story of what happens to her all in a very limited space. So I spent a lot of time making that work, and that was an interesting challenge in its own right. And that she's someone who wanted to be Clyde Tombaugh, who, for those of you who don't know, is the astronomer who discovered Pluto. And she fantasized, like she heard it, you know, she's born at a time when there's only 8 planets, and she's, you know, there's rumors of another one out there, and people are looking for this planet X. And, you know, she would go out with her dad, and she's looking with her little telescope trying to find it. And of course, that's not how you find a planet. You need a telescope that can take photographs. Then you need a machine called a blink comparator to compare different pictures of the same star field. So, but she's fascinated by this goal. And of course, you know, she eventually gets this sad lesson that, yeah, people who look like you don't get to be Clyde Tombaugh. And so I had to tell that story in a very quick fashion to explain what would possess her to drive out to the middle of the Wisconsin woods in the middle of the night alone. And the reason is she thinks that there's an observatory out there that, you know, she can use for herself. And then when she gets there and finds that it doesn't just look at the stars, you can do more of it than that. Why does she not run away screaming? Why does she stay and mess around with it? And basically I had to make that believable by the time you got there. It's like, yeah, I know why she's going to step through that doorway. So that was just a great character to write too. So those were my 2 favorites. But Letitia's just so fun because she's the character who says exactly what she's thinking, and she's also, if she can't sweet talk you or, you know, browbeat you into giving what she wants, she'll find a way to go around you and get what she wants. So I just love those characters who don't take no for an answer and who don't let themselves be stopped by circumstance. So they were just all really fun to write.
I can't wait to see that observatory.
I can't either, actually. I'm very curious to see how that's been translated.
Yeah.
No, normally I would pronounce her name Hippolyta. And I noticed
this is an area of controversy apparently, but I mean, I've always pronounced it Hippolyta, but you know, I pronounce Greek names and French names and other names of other languages wrong all the time. But it turned out, without asking me, that the TV show, they actually ended up pronouncing it that way as well.
Yeah,
but there was apparently some discussion about that, and I have not heard the full audiobook, but I know that the audiobook of Lovecraft Country was recorded by a Shakespearean actor, so he may well have said Hippolyta in his version. But you know, whatever. And I'm sure I gather there's at least 1 or 2 other ways you can pronounce it as well that people have used. So
of the things they added out of nowhere, what was your favorite? The adaptation. So the first 2 chapters only.
Great question.
I guess the bit in last week's episode with where they're all sort of in their separate rooms having these weird what they think, you think at first like that it's the real Atticus with Letitia, and then you slowly realize, oh no, they're all being tormented by these phantoms. And that was kind of an interesting bit of business.
I thought you were going to say the Jefferson theme.
Well, yeah. Well, that's true. Actually, that in general, I think the thing that impressed me the most is the use of spoken word as a soundtrack, like that whole the James Baldwin speech in the first episode is amazing, and it seems so obvious, but that's an example of something I've never seen that before anywhere, and I bet other people are going to start doing that too now. But this is the first time I've seen that, and that is very effective. And yeah. It's true. The Jefferson's theme is perfect, but in a weird way, again, that's a great translation because it sort of captures what I try to do in the novel, of like the excitement of, yeah, those 2 seconds when you arrive at the place and, oh, look, they've got a room with all my favorite stuff. And then you're like, well, wait a minute, that's not actually a good thing. And I that's funny. I noticed there's no stairwell from this part of the house. So how will I get out if there's a fire? So, yeah.
We're expected, and that's probably not good.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say that the cameo by Jackie Robinson was your favorite thing.
Well, that was also, that opening was really, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, yeah, you could put everything they added, and it's like, oh, that's really cool too. So, yeah.
You know, I'm sorry, Rick, did you have something else?
No, but just some people, I don't have a problem with this. I was hearing from Pete in a different conversation that some people are complaining that some of the things in the soundtrack are anachronistic, like having the Jeffersons and.
Well, that's just a style choice. I mean, if that doesn't work for you, it's not going to work for you. But Misha does that all the time.
It works for me. even the James Baldwin debate is like 10 years earlier than when it actually happened.
Yeah, people get caught up on these things instead of focusing on the real story and the real issues behind the story and what the story is trying to teach people
And,
who are not black,
It's also it's a different medium than the book.
Yes.
You know, it's what happens in the book doesn't necessarily translate well to the page. So it's more an adaptation than an actual translation. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's conveying the same thing but a different medium, so they have to change around the way that they do it.
Every TV show, movie that's adapted from a book has to be an adaptation. I mean, and Stephen King, even on the adaptations that he doesn't like, and there are a few of them,
Steve's definitely had that's a weird mixed track record with his stuff.
Yeah, but he says even if you don't like the adaptation, he's like, someone gave me the advice that they can't change a word that you've written on the page. That doesn't have anything to do with what you wrote. In your case, that's not the case, because it sounds like you're very happy with the first 5 episodes. Matt.
Oh yeah, no, I'm quite happy with it. But yeah, no, I think that, I think that's actually a King quote where he talks about James M. Cain was the author. He got that attitude from, where somebody talking about, oh, Hollywood has ruined all your books, and Cain just pointed to the books on the shelf and said, no, they're all still right there, exactly the way I wrote them. So yeah, and that always struck me as a very sensible attitude to have. Obviously, for some people, it's just very hard to let go. Just some people are so territorial and so possessive of their characters that even though they want the money and they want the movie, it's really hard to realize what that means. And I'm
going to badly paraphrase Laird again and say that he has this philosophy. He's going to kill me if I get this wrong, but that once it's out there, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people who are reading it, how they interpret it.
Sure.
If that makes sense. I mean, he says it way better than I just said it, but it's something along those lines.
Oh gosh, did you see the movie The Postman?
Yeah.
Il Postino.
No.
It was an Italian movie, and it's about this guy who uses the poetry of Pablo Neruda to woo a woman, and the postman who's trying to impress this woman, he ends up arguing with the poet. He says, poetry doesn't belong to those who wrote it. It belongs to those who use it.
Good point.
Okay, I was thinking of The Postman Always Rings Twice, which is a very different movie.
I was thinking of the Kevin Costner movie and thinking I'm never going to see that.
I was thinking of Kevin Costner too.
No, Il Postino. It's Italian.
Oh yeah, there is the Kevin Costner movie too. Yeah. Which I think David Brin just loves that.
It's right up there above Waterworld.
Yeah. So, but writing a book, a story, it's pretty much an individual process. You own everything on that page. That's yours.
Right.
The moment you translate it into comic book or graphic novel or radio show or film, you have to voluntarily give up control of that and let other people interpret your work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean that's both practically and in almost every case legally true. I mean, if you're J.K. Rowling, there are things you can put into a contract that where you can specify certain things. Like I believe the Harry Potter book, the Harry Potter movies, they had to hire a British kid to be the lead. If your property is worth enough, you can put in certain things like that, but inevitably they're not going to give you the kind of creative control that people who are control freaks who are really worried about their novel being ruined are going to want. Unless you make the film yourself and get final cut, there are going to be things that are different, and there's just no other way around that, and you just got to accept it. And the other thing about you were saying about that once the book goes out in the world, it's no longer yours. I think that is true to a large extent. Obviously, people are free to do what they want with it and react how they want. The one thing that is still what I try to do in reading other people's work is clearly there is a reason why they made certain decisions. There was an intent behind it. And even if I have a different take on their fiction, I do like to know what they were trying to accomplish and at least be fair about that, rather than, just say, well, this book is clearly about this, and I'm gonna say that's what the author must have meant. It's like author intent exists and you can get at it just the way you can try and, but it may not be relevant to what the culture does with it once it gets hold of it, because sometimes you just tap into something that doesn't really have anything to do with what you were thinking, that's why people get excited, and that's fine too.
That's a very healthy attitude for a writer to have whose work is adapted into film or TV and comic books and so forth. I remember, it's been so long now, but Interview with a Vampire, when that movie came out, Anne Rice just freaked. I mean, she freaked over the fact that Tom Cruise was selected to be Lestat. And then she watched the movie, and I think, if memory serves, she puts full-page ads in newspapers saying how much she retracts it and agrees with the choice and what a great job he did and everything. When it would have been better for her all along to let the creative team of the movie just do their work.
There was probably a
really
behind
good
the... Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Chesya.
No, I think a really good example of that is George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, the original. Right? He hired the main character as a Black man because he felt honestly that the Black man did the best job. When he and then it did not occur to him that race would be at all an issue within the film. I know, thinking back on it, it's like, wait a minute, how do you not, but it just didn't occur to him, and I think at one point he talks about having the film like in his car, in his trunk or something, and he's driving it somewhere, and that's when Martin Luther King was murdered, right? And he all of these things are happening at the same time, and he just is completely unaware of what it would look like to have this Black man, this Black body person, kind of against these zombies who are mainly white, and they're attacking him. It just never occurred to him, but it's just a really good example, I think, of what you're saying, Matt.
Well, that is
with the author, with the author not understanding.
I didn't know that.
The creator not understanding.
Yeah, I did not know that about Night of the Living Dead. That's fascinating.
I didn't either.
I was just going to say about Anne Rice, I'm sure there's a backstory that nobody knows about. I had a feeling that the guys who, at the movie studio probably pulled her aside and said, hey, we need you to stop.
Shut the hell up.
and I also believe that there is language in movie contracts today that probably is inspired directly by that. Like now, part of the thing is that you say you will not badmouth the story.
Yeah.
And
Rice had gone on record saying that Lestat was modeled off of Rutger Hauer.
Right. In fact, in one of the novels, a character points at Blade Runner playing on a TV and says, "That's Lestat right there." I mean, it's pretty blatant.
Right. And so, she's
Lestat the Dutchman. Yes.
Yeah. But the problem being that, Rutger Hauer got old in the process.
As we do.
as people do. And, he was no longer, he didn't command the star power that Tom Cruise was commanding at the time. And, things happen.
And damn it, whatever you think of Cruise as a person, he did a damn great job as Lestat.
Yeah, that was a good portrayal, but yeah. A lot of this is temperament, though. I mean, it's just yes, you say I have a healthy attitude, but part of that is just this is just sort of how I feel, and part of it too is obviously I've been very fortunate in how this particular book has been developed. But I just think for some people it's just really hard to get past that there are authors who just emotionally it's very difficult for them to let go, and I sympathize, but that's just part of the bargain you make.
One of the things that I've loved about Lovecraftian fiction is that it is out there in the public domain.
Yeah.
And that we've been allowed to develop that and play with it and send it in 1,000 different directions. And some of those have been really, really bad.
Oh, sure.
But some of them have worked out really, really well and would never have occurred to somebody who was actually managing the property.
Right.
Yeah, that's I mean, that's the thing is like, yeah, you can do the Shakespeare Lovecraft model where things are in public domain and the price you pay for the cool experiments that pay off or the many bad experiments that are horrible and make you want to tear your eyes out. And then there's the Marvel model where we treat it as a franchise. And on the one hand, you can sort of guarantee a consistent floor in quality that the movies are never that bad. But then there are also risks you're never going to take because people are like, well, it's not just the one movie, it's the franchise. We can't blow the brand, this $1 billion brand, on this crazy idea you have. So, and yeah, I tend to like the public domain whacking is better because you can always, if somebody does something stupid with it, you can just not watch it.
Right. Or it's like, yeah, that's not canon. We're just gonna.
Yeah. Speaking of risks, as we all here know, everything comes back in one way or the other to Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman.
Oh, does it?
Pete, yeah. Pete's like, oh my God, not again. I like 6 months ago, I tweeted something to the effect of, I'd love to see an African American Batman, and this is coming from one of the world's biggest Batman fans. And one of my friends tweeted back something to the effect of, are you out of your goddamn mind? And I didn't even know what to say to that, so I didn't respond. I mean, why can't we have a black Batman? Think of all the different things that you could explore. Maybe there's a different reason why his parents got murdered in that alley. Maybe it was racially motivated. There's just so many things that you can do. I read an article in Forbes lately from several years ago, and Carpenter, don't get started on this, that humans from another planet look the same, because there's reasons why this can happen.
Because actors are human and you can't hire a real alien.
Well, in the DCEU, it's strongly suggested that Kryptonians originally came from Earth. But anyway, you could also have an ancient galactic race that seeded the galaxy, And so, anyway, that being said, the article says that science says that Superman should be black. And I'll just quote one paragraph here. On Superman's home planet of Krypton, the best, because as we all know, he gets his powers mainly from the sun. Quit shaking your head, Pete. On Superman's home planet of Krypton, the best pigment color for absorbing solar radiation would be black. Light-capturing pigments act as antennas tuned for picking up photons with a particular energy, and their colors, how they look to our eyes, is determined by which photons they absorb. There's just so many things that you can do. So many fans have this. They feel like they own the characters. This alien character must be Caucasian. He's got to look like us, right? He has to. It's ridiculous. He can't be African American. He can't be anything else. So, Batman's human. Why can't he be African American or another race?
So I think that what's at play here is very specifically the way that, in order for a lot of superheroes to be black, their whole core would have to, in so many ways, be different. Their whole ideologies would have to be different. This is why I talk a lot about, let's say, someone like Storm, is because I think that the way that she's written by white creators is not the way that she would exist when actually as a black woman existing in society, right? Mm-hmm. I do not believe that she would be a part of the X-Men. I do not think that it makes a lot of sense. And if she does, it would be very specifically to help her people. So the idea of her leaving her own community in order to help white people, and, even though they're mutants still, even, when we're looking at, the X-Men, they uphold society as it exists. They're not trying to change it, right? And for her as a black woman, very specifically in society that is not only black, not only a woman, but also a mutant and a very visible mutant, at that, I think that she would exist differently if written by black women, right? And I think that would be the same when we're talking about a lot of these superhero characters, right? What would a black Superman look like, right? What historically would he have done? What would he fought for? Right. We have a lot of these, comic books that hint at, injustice, but don't really do a whole lot about real injustice when it comes to on the American shores. But a Superman, a Batman would have to do those things, right?
Yeah.
Or it would be, disingenuous. So I think that, that's a lot of what we're looking at, and I think many people know it.
I think what you're saying, like these comics books, they're not history, they're not horror, they're fantasy.
Right.
It's like if like I actually got fed up with superhero movies because it's like, well, why? Geez, Superman, fix global warming. Why are people hungry? Can you get fresh water to people who need it? It's like it's like the things that you're fighting are like another Squid Man. I mean,
yeah, you're absolutely right, Chesya. The whole story. Let's take Batman. The whole story would change. His fight would change. What he would fight for would change. And I'm not saying, okay, make Batman black and make him exactly the way that he is. I'm saying what an interesting story.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
What an interesting storyline to explore. If he was black, how would he change? What would he fight for instead? Who would he fight? What would he do?
Right.
It's
right.
And
I agree. And I know that's what you're saying, which is why I think that people resist it, is because they don't want to, like Batman is their hero. Superman is their hero. If Batman has to talk about race and talk about things, that means that something is wrong with them, that they're not also doing it. And so I think that's where you see a lot of the pushback. People don't want to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, Batman is sort of like the idealized vigilante, which is a weird territory to get into.
He's cosplaying a superhero, and nobody says it, but it's true.
Yeah, and
Chesya, be careful.
I know it.
I'm kidding.
I know. I'm gonna catch a lot of shit, but
I'm
sorry. Having a superhero discussion, I think we should bring in the Black Panther, considering the reason.
Yes, I wanted to mention that. Oh my gosh, Chesya, would you like to say something about that? Chadwick Boseman.
It's. I mean, what is there to say?
I didn't even know he had cancer, and I found out. I haven't read this in depth yet. I haven't had time, but apparently Denzel Washington funded him going to college. Do I have that right? Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
I think there was a group of actors who had been accepted at Oxford but couldn't afford to go, and Denzel stepped in and paid their tuition. One of them was Chadwick Boseman. So.
Right. Exactly.
That's
what I read on Twitter, so it may or may not be exactly right.
Yeah, for the last 2 days, I honestly did just kind of check out. So.
I mean, that's just beautiful that he did that, and the fact that Chadwick Boseman accomplished so much while very few people knew that he had this, So on a show like what we're talking about today, Rick, was it you that brought this up? I did have it in my notes, but I appreciate you reminding me. It's appropriate to mention him.
I just wanted to mention that, going back to what Chesya said about the Storm. When I first read The Black Panther in around 66 spring, he was way ahead of his time, but looking back at it, it was still sort of a white man's view of Africa. It really didn't get its true potential until they made it was in the comic before the film, but until they made it truly reflect African culture, which is one of the beauties of the film.
Yeah, I taught the original about a year ago, and it's tough to get through because it is not very subtle racism, right? But at the time, it would have been progressive just because you have a black main character. So it's really interesting to look back on it and look at the way that it's kind of progressed since then.
All right, guys. Anything else on Lovecraft Country that we want to ask Matt while he's here, or comment on, or anything?
Yes. So people want to know on the live chat, what's next? Is there a sequel? Was this a standalone? Is there going to be any more? Or what's next for you?
Well, what's immediately next for me, behind me here, is the novel that just came out, 88 Names, which is a completely different story. It's my virtual reality novel. It's basically set 20 years in the future. Protagonist is a guy named John Chu, who's what's known as a Sherpa, which is basically a professional guide to online video games. So you want to play World of Warcraft, but you have a real life, so you don't have 200 hours to spend building up a character. You can pay him a fee, and he will provide you with a ready-made high-level character and a team of expert players to come cater a night's adventure for you. So he gets a new client who's offering him $100,000 a week for a comprehensive tour of the world of online VR gaming, which is one of those deals that sounds way too good to be true, but the money is real, so he takes the job, but he begins to suspect that his new client is actually the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. And
that's bad.
So this is the first 2/3 of the novel are set entirely in virtual reality, and so you've got total control over how you look and sound, and machine translation is advanced to the point where you can pass yourself off as a native speaker of a language you've never studied. And most of the people John Chu is interacting with, not just this client, but his coworkers and even his girlfriend, are people he's never actually met in real life. So it's this weird cat and mouse game set in cyberspace. And then the third section of the book, they finally come out into real life, and you get to see what the answer to the mystery is. So, but as far as what I'm thinking about next, Lovecraft Country was written as a standalone.
Excuse me, Matt, I'm sorry. No, is 88 Games out now?
Yes, it's been out since March. It kind of it came out just before the pandemic lockdown happened. So I did do a sort of truncated book tour online, but if you haven't heard of it, that's why. And then Lovecraft Country has kind of eclipsed it again now with the TV series coming out, but it's still
that's what you call a good problem to have. But you want people to read the book. Yeah. Anyway, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah. The Lovecraft Country, the novel, it was written to be a standalone book, and it does end somewhat open-ended. Not because I wanted to necessarily write a sequel, just because I knew that my characters, they have a small victory at the end of the story, but they were still going to wake up black in America in the 1950s the next day, and so it's not like they could just live happily ever after. It's more like we've seen that they know how to find their way in the world, and we trust that they'll be able to meet whatever new challenges are coming. But it just I couldn't wrap everything up neatly with a bow. But the story has stayed with me since then, and so I've been thinking about going back in there. The issue is that if I reopen the story, it won't just be one book, it'll be 2 or possibly 3. And I write pretty slowly, and I don't, I love you, George Martin, but I don't want to be George Martin. But the fact that I'm still thinking about this 4 years after the fact means I at least want to take a run at it. So I've written about 30,000 words of a sequel.
Oh, nice.
I'm happy with, I think it's really good. Again, it'll just be a question of when I get a little further along, I will have a conversation with my agent and my publisher, and we'll see. So at the very least, it is possible. I can't say for sure, because it would be a big project, a big commitment for me and for my publisher. And, but people seem certainly very enthusiastic about the idea, and I'm having fun. So,
there's a lot to explore there.
Ask me again in 6 months to a year, and I'll have a more definitive answer. So,
just to change tracks again real quick, to go back, your synopsis of 88 Names, it just sounds very, very fascinating to me. I'm going to pick that up.
Thank you.
And so anybody listening, watching, pick it up, support Matt Ruff, because we want more Matt Ruff HBO projects, possibly movies, things like that. Right, Matt? So I have to wrap this up pretty quick, because I've learned that YouTube gets very angry with me if I go over 2 hours and messes up the video. So we've got about 13 minutes though. So in that time, I would like to quote Chadwick Boseman I love this quote. We've all gone through struggles, some of us more than others. And I love his quote, the struggles along the way are only meant to shape you for your purpose. I didn't know he said that till after his death, but that's a quote that I'm going to carry with me for the rest of my life. So yeah, I wanted to bring that up, especially in light of what we're talking about and his struggle with colon cancer and his recent passing. Before we got just a couple of other topics to cover that are not Lovecraft Country. Does anybody else have anything on Lovecraft Country before we just move on for a second? Buy the book. It's on Kindle. It's on print. Is it on audiobook too? I think it is. Yeah. Yep. Watch the show.
88 names this too, by the way. It's
okay. So
audiobook.
Episodes 3 and 4 of Lovecraft Country will be on movie night in 2 weeks. Watch for announcements.
Yes, and if you go to my Twitter account or my Facebook account, go to Twitter, my Twitter account, or actually in the show notes here, I've got this is simpler. I've got my Linktree link. My friend James Harrison told me about Linktree, and it's so useful. I've got Matt Carpenter. I've got a link to the Easing Cast movie night chat room, whatever you want to call it, down near the bottom of those links. So, click on that. We do it. Matt does it every night for me at 8:30 Central Time, and it's a lot of fun. You can watch the movie and text chat along, kind of like we're doing here. Only you're watching the movie instead of listening to us talk. So, Pete, real quick, Left Right Game Podcast. You're gonna need to unmute to talk.
Yeah, the Left Right Game Podcast. Oh my God! So a couple of weeks ago, I had to go up to Orlando. I didn't want to go by myself, so I went with a friend, and he's like, all right, I'm going to drive while you listen to this podcast, The Left Right Game. I'm like, what? I don't do podcasts. I don't need more media.
It's an audio drama.
It's an audio drama. It stars and is produced by Tessa Thompson.
Ooh.
The guy the lady who kicks Thor's ass in Thor Ragnarok.
Yes. Holy crap. First of all, the sound quality is incredible. The storyline is fascinating.
This is weird fiction cosmic horror, I think you told me.
It's weird fiction cosmic horror. The premise of the game, the podcast, is that there's a reporter who works for like NPR, it's called American Stories, who stumbles onto...
This American Life?
No, it's called American Stories. Who stumbles onto this paranormal investigator who's exploring what he calls the left-right game. And the idea is you get in your car and you take the first left, and then you take the first right, then you take the first left, and you take the first right. And after 37 iterations, you come to a tunnel. And you go through the tunnel and you keep going, and you're no longer in our world.
Stop. That's all I want to know.
And he's done this in a bunch of cities, and it always works.
Yeah, I'm starting it tonight when I go to bed.
And I think it's 8 episodes or 10 episodes, each about 45 minutes long.
Yeah, it's done. You can listen to the entire thing. Pete said.
Really, really good. Minimal commercials. I actually think it's the whole purpose of the program is to sell their own speakers, so that they designed for podcasting.
Well, they can sell whatever they want. It sounds like it's great.
Really, really good stuff.
Gonna try that
the name of
next
it
time
one
I
more
go out
time?
walking. Okay.
It's the Left Right Game Podcast.
I think it's on Apple. Is it on Apple?
Probably on everything. I know it's on Spotify.
Yeah.
All right.
I have not been this excited about a piece of media in a long time.
Well, Pete, and I've said this for the years I've been hosting this show, what an incredible fan I am of audio drama ever since, the days of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then, Mystery Theater in the 70s and early 80s. And then, with the internet, there's a resurgence of audio drama. And there's some bad, and then there's some what sounds like great, like this one. So
Yeah, this
I
one's really,
appreciate
really well
you telling me about this.
So the first turn is left, just so I know when I try this next time. I'm
Okay, so yeah, so afterwards we're debating I'm talking to my friend, and we're debating all this. It's like the rules don't even say that you have to be in a car. You could just do this on the street, in any sufficiently large enough building, as long as you can get through 37 or 38 turns.
Right.
You could do it anywhere.
This reminds me of Angel Season 5, Underneath, the episode where Gun's like, you ever drive I think it's the Camaro, and it's driving itself, and Angel and Spike and Gun are in the car, and Angel's like, I'm not familiar with these streets, and Gun goes, where we're going, not in the Thomas Guide. And then they go through this tunnel, and they're in another dimension. So
yeah, it's very much like that.
Yeah.
But
all right.
Just super well done.
Okay. The lady who was she was not on. I interviewed some of the actors and writers from Host a few weeks back. Great people. I hope I'm saying your name right, Salen. Salen Baxter was the lady who played the seance lady. Did not know this. Rick, you're going to love this. If you don't already know, you probably do. You know everything. She plays the woman who finds the timeless child in Doctor Who. And she becomes the first Time Lord. Remember that?
Oh, yes.
It's sort of the mother of Doctor Who.
Yeah. She plays that character. And I asked her if she'd be on the show. I have yet to schedule her. I need to email her back. And she said, yeah, I'll come on the show as long as you don't cut your hair. And I said, I'm a fan of yours, but I love my wife. I'm very happily married, and I got to cut my hair. So she's still going to come on the show. The Stand remake is coming in December, for those of you who do not know.
It is actually coming. I was wondering. I was thinking this is the perfect time for it, but I wondered if they did that thing where it's like too close to home, so they delayed it.
I guess not. Well, people are buying all kinds of pandemic books. I mean, look at Paul. Survivor Song people are loving it. You know? So
I totally agree. That's a great idea. I just know that corporations are sometimes, well, we can't do that now. Now that it's actually topical, we can't do it.
Yeah, Paul was like, I feel really bad that it's coming out now. And I was like, people are watching all these pandemic shows on Netflix. It's gonna be fine. And he's a great writer. He's a very empathic writer. Paul Tremblay, for those who don't know, read Paul Tremblay's Survivor Song, and read while we're on the subject of Paul Tremblay, read my favorite Tremblay book, which is Disappearance at Devil's Rock. So, anyway, and also, Lake Mungo is now streaming on Amazon Prime. So if you have not seen Lake Mungo, Matt Carpenter, I'm gonna mute you if you say anything.
Secret ballot.
Matt doesn't like it. Everyone else in the world disagrees with Matt Carpenter. The Boys, September 4, apparently. Even bloodier than the first season is what I read. The Boys, the bad superhero show. Not that it's a bad show, they're bad superheroes. So,
what about the Kickstarter Pete wanted to mention?
Kickstarter. Oh, yes. Yeah, Pete, go ahead.
What are you talking about?
They got if you're watching this live, you have time to get in on this.
Yeah.
If not, if you're it because it's got like what 5 hours left, 3 hours left.
Yeah, like I think it ends at midnight. So
So what's it called? What? How
okay.
they
So
Google
on
Kickstarter
Kickstarter,
and what?
it's only on Kickstarter.
Yeah, Google Kickstarter and what?
Okay, so the project is called Growing Up / Overnight. It's 2 Cthulhu Mythos fiction books. A couple of years ago, we did a collection of short stories about characters that Oscar Rios from Golden Album Press created that were kids versus the mythos.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple months ago, he started working on gaming adventures that you could play those kids as adults. And I popped in and I said, "Oh, so we're going to write adult stories." And he's like, "I hadn't thought of that." And then all the other authors chimed in and said, "We all want to write, adult stories about these kids. Where did these kids end up 10 years later?" It's essentially it. With what happened next. So yeah, we put out stories very, very quickly. They're really good. We're combining it with another project that we had left over from a Kickstarter that didn't go anywhere, called Between Twilight and Dawn. It's stories set, from when the sun goes down to when the sun comes up.
Yeah, great title.
Yeah, we liked it, but it was a bonus add-on to a Kickstarter that only got so far, so it never went to press. So we're literally $750 away from our $12,000 goal, and that's really modest.
750.
Yeah.
Oh wow! Because I posted about it several times today. I was hoping.
Yeah, we're really, really close. I mean, yesterday I think we were $2,000 down, and now we're within distance.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of good stories in there. I've read 5 or 6 of them. My story is set in Kingsport and deals with photography at a Kingsport Christmas party. If you know what goes on in Christmas at Kingsport, then spirit photography is probably not a good idea.
Probably not.
No. So anyway,
all right.
Yeah.
Google Kickstarter and what again?
Hold on, because I've just rambled. It's Growing Up Overnight.
Okay. Wow, that's a heartbreaker. 750 away. We have to help them make that goal.
Yeah.
All right. Before we close, any last words from you, Matt Ruff, or Chesya? Maybe something that I should have asked, I should have covered, but didn't. Anything of that nature, Chesya? Nothing.
No, nothing.
Well,
I
wait,
have a million and 2 questions, but they can never
you
get
have a book
into.
coming out or anything that you can plug for us?
Yeah. Plug your stuff.
Yes, of course.
Please.
Well, I mean, I have a lot of things on the back burner that I can't really talk about. I do have a Storm academic book about Storm from the X-Men that's coming out from Rutgers University Press.
Oh, really?
And that's, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
cool.
It's due in January, so when it's coming out, we don't know yet. But yeah,
title?
So that's the one I can talk about.
What's the title, Chesya?
It's Hero Me Not, actually.
Hero Not? Okay.
Hero Me Not.
Hero Me Not. Okay. All right.
Hero Me Not, yes.
All right.
Chesya, have you been to ICFA?
I have, yeah, a couple times actually.
Okay, I've gone a lot.
Oh yeah.
So that's probably where I know you from. Okay, I mean, it's been bothering me all night. It's like I know this.
Yeah, that's probably it. Yeah.
Matt, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. What I have seen of Lovecraft Country on HBO so far is wonderful, and I really sincerely wish you the best, and I really sincerely say that this is well deserved. I'm glad that you tackled this subject. I'm glad that you had the courage as a white guy to tackle this subject too, because I've seen complaints. Why is a white guy writing about this? Well, why shouldn't he? Why should?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that should be my closing statement, which is just that I've been, you know, I always thought that if I did a good job, that, you know, people would be open to this, and the reaction I've gotten to the book has been incredibly warm, particularly from Black readers, and so I would just encourage people, yeah, take chances and do your homework and don't be nervous. I mean, well, be nervous, but channel your anxiety into doing the best possible job that you can, rather than using it as a reason not to take the chance, I guess is the way to put it. And you know, even if you don't get the golden ticket, at least you'll create something that will have been worth doing and that you can be satisfied with, which frankly I would have been happy just to do that. And not that I'm complaining about what has happened, but I'm just, you know, this is, I've been incredibly fortunate, but like I say, just having the book exist at all has been wonderful. So and the show is on tonight. Just, you know, I probably don't need to remind anybody who's been following it, but yes, it's starting in, looks like it should be dropping in about an hour on HBO Max. So.
Yeah. Last thing I'll say is Linda Addison says, homework well done, Matt Ruff.
Oh, thank you.
So, which is a very high compliment. Matt, thank you so much for being on the show. Chesya, thank you. And as usual, thanks to the rest of you for being on the show. And we'll see everybody next week. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.